Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
Now, this is a story that has been front and center in the news for a long time, and now the departure of IDAC's leadership is prompting calls for the corruption fighting unit to be completely reset. But Karam Singh, who's head of liaison and advocacy at Good Governance Africa, is arguing that replacing leaders or simply repairing IDAC is not going to defeat the powerful networks behind systemic corruption. He goes on to say that South Africa needs a fundamentally different and genuinely independent anti-corruption architecture. He joins me on the program now. Karam, welcome to you. So why is simply fixing IDAC not enough?
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Well, I'm trying to go back through my history and understand how the IDAC was created, and if you look at when Cyril Ramaphosa becomes president in 2019, there is a clamor, in the wake of state capture and the capture of a criminal justice sector to show that we're doing something in the fight against corruption. And that the independent directorate gets created within the MPA. Now, the whole logic of the independent directorate is this idea that we have a specialized prosecution-led investigations, particularly in terms of the fight against corruption. This is the gap that's been left by the Scorpions. Now, as I see it, the process to create the IDAC ultimately is a half measure. It's something which falls short of best practice, of what we understand, even what the Constitutional Court has told us in the Glenister judgment in terms of, what's required for South Africa. We need an end-to-end comprehensive anti-corruption agency, independent directorates situated within the police, which has to go through its own process of reform, or the MPA, which also has to go through this renewal process now, is only going to be a stopgap. It's not going to be the kind of comprehensive response that's required to deal with the kind of grand corruption threat that we sit with.
Let me come back to the proposed anti-corruption agency, but the weaknesses in IDAC itself, as you outlined to me, could they not simply be corrected through new legislation?
There are issues around the fact that the IDAC resides within the MPA. Now, there's been a long battle that the MPA's had around its own independence and the fact that it doesn't have that it falls under the Department of Justice. It doesn't have its own budget, control over its own budget. It's not its own accounting officer. The accounting officer is the Director General of the Department of Justice. IDAC is even once removed within that because IDAC is a substructure within the MPA. So what's being discussed in terms of the reset? Okay, we're stuck with the IDAC now. We have permanent legislation. So, the process of renewal has to happen. There has to be a review of the leadership. But fundamentally, there are no special measures around who gets appointed to be head of the IDAC. There's no special measures which talk about how the head of the IDAC would be removed. These are all processes which are subject to executive control. And this is the real challenge that we have in the fight against corruption, is that we don't have an independent anti-corruption entity which is outside of this executive control. So the executive, when push comes to shove, we have a crisis, let's reset, let's parachute new leadership in. We saw this challenge with the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. We had an independent panel. They couldn't recommend a name. So the president then plucks Advocate Matibi from the SIU, who's subject to, retirement in a couple of years because of age limits. So, it seems very piecemeal, our approach to fighting corruption. It's not consistent with what's in the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. It's not consistent with the recommendations from the National Advisory Council Against Corruption, and it's in tension with the recommendations from the Zondo Commission.
So the proposed anti-corruption agency that you're suggesting would, giving one body investigative as well as prosecutorial powers, not, Karam, create something of a dangerous overreach?
Of course, and I think, this is really the challenge that we sit with, Jeremy. Why are we not kind of embracing this big idea? Because we're reticent. We've seen our the criminal justice sector susceptible to capture. And there's no doubt about it. This is going to be a continued battle in terms of building our democracy, building effective institutions, their vulnerability to capture. So then, what structures do we put in place to make them less vulnerable? We ensure that there's special procedures around the appointments of the leadership. We make sure that there's special procedures around the dismissal of that leadership. We make sure that there's rigorous lifestyle audits and internal integrity so that there's an integrity standard. And we make sure that there is effective oversight. Can there still be abuses of power within that type of a system? Absolutely. And I'm not naive to say that the challenges of the IDAC go beyond the challenges of institutional design, because we're still dealing with individuals, and individuals can abuse their power.
I understand the criticism and I understand the proposal, but are you also not dismissing some of IDAC's achievements?
I don't, I think this should not be, let's talk about IDAC's achievements. There have been a number of high-profile corruption cases which have been enrolled. We saw some significant progress in an early case with the VBS case, but many of the other cases have stalled. Are there particular achievements that you're thinking about, Jeremy, that I'm overlooking? Has the needle been moved by IDAC's kind of approach to fighting corruption? I mean, the SIU to me looks like a more effective agency in terms of asset recovery. If you look at the amounts of assets which have been recovered in front of the special tribunal, I think we can call that significant. But if we look at the high-profile prosecutions which we were promised after the Zondo Commission, they've really been few and far between. I don't know if that's purely on IDAC's bat. I'm not saying that IDAC is completely rotten. I'm saying that IDAC was a half measure when it was put in place, and it doesn't actually grasp the nettle in terms of what's envisioned in terms of an institutional realignment to effectively deal with the grand corruption challenge that we sit with.
The new anti-corruption agency aside, and this is a last question to you, be that as it may, there's been a lot of mess around this whole issue. In the short term, in the immediate term, is there any reform that government could implement to prove right now that it's serious about defeating kleptocracy?
I mean, I think it's important that there is some transparency around the reset, around the leadership of the criminal justice system. So, we still have to see the Madlanga Commission kind of play itself out. But I think, in terms of the lifestyle audits that we expect of the leadership, and that the fact that that's made available to us, that's a transparent process, I think that would go a long way. But I'm not an advocate, Jeremy, for silver bullets. Whether it be reform of the public procurement system, which is not a short game, whether it's ensuring that we have effective protection for whistleblowers, which again is not low-hanging fruit, or we deal with this institutional architecture question in terms of the establishment of an appropriate law enforcement response. I don't think that there's any quick wins that show us that there's the effective political will to drive this thing. It's going to be something which is going to take time, but we do need greater indications that there is the political will to take on the challenge. And that, I think, is in doubt at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to leave it there. Karam Singh is Head of Liaison and Advocacy at Good Governance Africa.